And then Lynn decides to go find his bell.
Yeah, that's right. Gotta get things organized here.
Anytime you want.
Anytime I want?
Yep,
all right.
we can go.
We do a couple of formal things to make us remember that we're Rotary. And of course, bell ringing was always a big part of Rotary meetings when everybody met in person. So Farmington Rotary does 2 items involving the bell. One is opening the meeting and one is closing the meeting. And we do another little thing at the end of the meeting, but we'll cover that when we get there. So when the bell rings, the meeting will come to order.
Here we go. Well, good morning, everybody. Other people may be joining us as we proceed along, but for the moment, we'll go as we are. I'd like to introduce you to Erica Clites. Is that how to pronounce it, Erica?
Yep, exactly.
I wasn't sure. I found Erica's information, or at least the story about invasive species, while browsing a local newspaper. And when I contacted Erica asking her to come here to talk to us, she was most agreeable and signed up 3 different times because I screwed up the meeting arrangements. And finally, here we are. We're actually, Erica is here to talk to us, and I'm really looking forward to this one. I think I know what invasive species are, but I certainly don't know what each of them are. So Erica, you can tell us about your organization and the invasive species and anything else you like. You have up till 9 o'clock, up till 9 o'clock. Take your time. Ask for questions if you like. Otherwise, just go ahead. You can do your presentation.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again for the invitation. I always like speaking to community groups, and I had mentioned to Phil that I spoke to the Milford Rotary back in the pre-pandemic time. So I'm happy to be here to speak with you today. And it's fun for me because, yeah, I haven't gotten to do many of these talks in the last year and a half or so. So thanks for the invitation. I'm going to get my screen up here. Let's see. Okay, and are you seeing the one that's like full screen?
Yep.
The slides? Okay, perfect. Okay, all right, so we'll just jump right in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts of invasive species today. And I'm going to talk about the CISMA, that's the organization that I represent. And then I'm going to talk specifically about some invasive species. As Phil has kind of alluded to, there are a lot of different types of them. But I'll hit some of the major ones that I know are in the Farmington Hills area. And then I'll talk a little bit at the end about kind of the next invaders. So these are ones that, one of the things that CISMA works on is trying to keep the next things that are coming in from becoming as overwhelming as the ones that we already have here. So that's kind of where we're headed. So just to make sure everyone's on the same page, invasive species are ones that are not native to Michigan and that cause harm. Could be harm to the economy, environment, or human health. And it can include anything from, this is a fungus that causes death of red oak trees called oak wilt. This is spotted lanternflies, which luckily we don't have in Michigan yet, but they are pretty close, so we definitely need to keep an eye out. And then 2 that are actually pretty near the Farmington Hills area. This is European frogbit that I'll talk more about, that's found in the Novi and Northvale area. And this is red swamp crayfish, which have also been found in that same general area. So
they look big.
They do get, they're sometimes referred to as they looking like lobsters. Yeah, and they can get pretty large for sure. Yeah. Oh, and I didn't say that, but yeah, feel free to, if you have questions, just go ahead and stop me and ask them. So I'm fine with that. So okay, and then I just wanted to do a quick clarification because sometimes it's confusing. We think of these things that are in our yard that are annoying as weeds, which is a fine term. Weed doesn't necessarily mean invasive. So usually people use weeds for any kind of unwanted plant, could be native or invasive. So like dandelions, are often considered a weed, but they are native and they do, for example, provide pollen to a lot of our pollinators. So, and for weeds or for the native plants, we don't really, the CISMA doesn't really work on those as much. So those are good questions to ask of MSU Extension. They have like a gardening hotline. We can kind of direct you to them too, but the ones that we work on more are the invasive species, so those non-native species. Okay, so why are invasive species a problem? It's because they have few natural competitors. So most of the time, many of these species were either introduced on purpose, unfortunately, when we were still in kind of the idea that like, as we come from a new place to America, we should bring our plants and things too. And some of them have been introduced accidentally. So sometimes like they're used as packing material, or for the insects, like they're, you know, on some other item that gets shipped. So the way that our world is globally connected now also is just facilitating the spread of these species. But usually when we get the invasive species, we don't get their natural competitors. So most of these species are not at all a problem in their original location, but when they come here and then none of our plants and animals are also adapted to eat them, so they have a big advantage over our native plants. And so they end up doing things like this, where you see this is a vine actually growing over just like everything. They just get very, they unbalance everything that way. They can also, many of them can actually change the soil chemistry. So they actually release chemicals into the soil, which impacts the ability of other plants to grow there. So just some examples. And this is, I'm going to talk a little bit about bittersweet later, but this is a vine that actually can get really thick and actually strangles trees if it gets big enough.
Eric,
So yeah, go ahead.
On that last slide, what is the name of that vine? This one?
It's called Asian bittersweet.
I saw a lot of that in Southeast when we were traveling through the Carolinas and South Carolina, Northern Florida, Georgia.
Yeah, it could certainly be the case.
Is that
I was
something?
in Mississippi, there's a
close to us?
kudzu vine, which envelops it. Is kudzu native to Mississippi, but not Michigan?
Kudzu is, no, kudzu is an invasive to the whole US as far as I know. And yeah,
Thank you,
that's a
Rick.
bad one. I think there's only a couple instances of it in Michigan so far, but we're hoping we don't get that one. And then Lynn, for the Asian bittersweet, yeah, it's from Asia originally, so it would be invasive anywhere in the US. Typically the patterns we see are like they'll be introduced often on like the East Coast and go like east to west in their spread. And sometimes they also go like south to north in their spread. So as as it's getting warmer here a bit, we're seeing more of the species that may have started out in the south coming farther north. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, sure. So other impacts that we see from invasive plants, including damaging infrastructure. So this is a plant called Phragmites, which I'll show you some other pictures of, but you can see it along a lot of roadways. And it can break through, it can come through like bridges, but also the edges of roads. I'm going to talk about this one as well. This is knotweed. Luckily, at this point, it's not as bad here as it is in Great Britain. Knotweed is considered one of the most invasive plants in the world. And in Great Britain, you can't sell a house without like an agreement about treating knotweed because it's just gotten so bad there. So this knotweed actually came from an area of volcanic soil. So it's just used to being like covered over by lava flows and then popping back up again. So some of the plant's natural characteristics that they've evolved for where they came from make them really harder to get rid of once they get here. They can also limit access to water and recreation. So this is one example, a photo from the same area in 1990. You can see the people standing out in the shallow water here. And then in 2012, so Phragmites, in the last 20 or 30 years, we've seen a big invasion of it. It has been present in Michigan before that, but didn't seem to be as aggressive as it is now. And we're not always sure of the reasons for that. So sometimes we would call these like sleeper species. Like sometimes we don't know what all the characteristics are that will make something, present, but not that overwhelming. And suddenly it switches and it starts spreading everywhere. But this is a really bad species in wetland areas and also in lakes, because it can tend to just, this is a similar photo. So showing the lake axis here without Phragmites and with Phragmites. So obviously you can see the impacts that this would have on your ability to actually get out on the lake. And for our natural resources, for our birds and turtles and other species, the impacts are similar. So it's just not that easy for most species to move through kind of a thick forest like this of Phragmites. There can also be safety and fire hazards. So with Phragmites, it's very dry when it burns. And so a couple of years ago now, there was a fire near the Great Lakes Crossing Mall where they actually had to close 75 for a while. And that was because of a gas main break that caught on fire a lot of dead Phragmites. So it just burns really, really hot. And so in general, from an ecological perspective, what invasive plants do is they tend to create monocultures, which just means they're the only plant that's present. So that's what you see, this person standing here. Phragmites can easily get 15 or 20 feet tall. And you can see where they've cut some of it back. There's just nothing else living there because it's outcompeted. It's grown taller than everything else. It's grown thicker, so nothing can get through there. And that's not what our natural ecosystems look like. So our natural ecosystems look more like this picture on the lower right, where you can see this is some cattails and these are some other flowering plants. So it should be more of a diversity of types of plants. And that also supports better our plants and animals. Okay, so just a little bit about what CISMAs are. They do exist. There is a CISMA that covers every county in Michigan. And these organizations exist outside of Michigan as well. Sometimes they have different names, but the idea is it's a group of organizations that come together to work on invasive species issues. As you can imagine, invasive species don't care about our property lines. So, they're always going across from a state park into a local park or across from a local park into someone's yard. So the idea with the CISMAs is that we're a group of organizations that work together to combat the invasive species. So we partner with a lot of organizations, and we also provide general advice and information to the public. So for Oakland County CISMA, we're just a one county, and our mission is to support functioning ecosystems and enhance quality of life through invasive species management. We've received over $660,000 in grant funding since our founding in 2014. Most of that is through a state grant program called the Michigan Invasive Species Grant Program, which is the one that has kind of assisted a lot of the CISMAs in forming. We have a strategic invasive species management plan, currently 2 full-time staff, and over 40 partners. Many of our partners are the municipalities in Oakland County, so including Farmington Hills. Our current representative from there is with Farmington Hills Parks and Recreation, but we partner with a lot of the other cities, villages, and townships in Oakland County. And in addition, we also partner with county agencies like the Road Commission, Parks and Recreation, Economic Development, Water Resources, and then we partner with land conservancies. So land conservancies, if you're not familiar with those, are organizations that work with private landowners that want to conserve their land. So sometimes there's like a natural part of your land that you want to set aside to have it forever stay in a natural state. And when you do that, it reduces the tax value of the land, and that agreement, that change to the property status is permanent. So it can never be changed back into a development or something else. So even if the land is sold, that status stays the same. So that's other organizations that we work with. And then also other nonprofits like the watershed councils. Okay, so what do CISMAs do? So we focus on prevention and education. So that includes, we've been hosting webinars since the pandemic started, and we host a half-day Saturday event in March, typically, called the Invasive Species Summit. presenting on various invasive species topics. We present to local groups like this one. We do outreach to homeowner associations and lake associations, and we provide resources, including we just respond to phone calls and emails, helping people identify and control invasive species. We have a website, which you can check out. I have the link at the end. And then this year we've been working on a lot of new outreach materials to share as well. And we've got physical copies of a lot of those too, if anyone is interested. We also do what I alluded to is early detection and response. So that means we already have, Michigan has like right now a couple hundred invasive species. And some of these that we've had for a while, you know, they cost in the neighborhood of like $20 million a year. That's just to keep them like at a manageable level. So you think of something like zebra mussels that gets on infrastructure and has to be removed, or sea lamprey is another one that impacts our ability to fish in Michigan, which obviously is a big important recreation and tourism source. So we can't keep adding more species onto this list over time that we need to invest this much money in managing. So we're trying to just get earlier in the process to kind of stamp these species out before they get established. So that means we do surveys in the county. We verify public reports. We assist with the response to various projects like that red swamp crayfish work. Chinese yam is another, what's called in Michigan a watch list species. So it means it's one that is not widespread and that we're trying to keep a closer eye on. That was discovered in last year in Oakland County. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this grant that we have for frog bit work, but those are just some examples of responding to those new detections of species. And then we also do collaborative long-term management. So that's kind of like being in it for the long haul, making sure that projects are managed appropriately and consistently over time. So since 2019, all the Phragmites, that tall invasive grass that you can often see along roadways,
Yep.
Along the county roads, the primary, secondary, and natural beauty roads has been managed through a cost share program with the communities. So this is just a map showing the yellow lines are where there was not invasive species and the green lines are Phragmites. So that's an example of something that we do. So every year we survey several of the townships to update that data, and then we work with the contractors to actually treat that Phragmites. Yeah, one example of a larger project. And then we do hold monthly meetings with guest speakers for all of our partners, and we work with them. Another longer term thing we work on is model ordinances. So not all communities by any means, but several of the communities in Oakland County have passed some type of invasive species ordinance. Sometimes they're specific to one species like Phragmites, and some of them are more general. And the idea with those is usually they're less for private land than they are for like business owners and things, because it can be hard to enforce getting people to take care of the invasive species. But if you're already investing in treating the road right of ways and you're investing in treating your parks, you know, you don't want to have a few neighboring properties that are just never going to treat it. So that's one way to get those areas treated as well. Okay, so we'll jump into the part about the invasive species themselves. So I've talked about this plan a couple times, but
Wow.
Phragmites, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that 20 foot tall. My goodness.
I know, it really does get, yeah, it's pretty wild. So especially if it's been there for a long time, it'll get really tall like that. So Phragmites australis, known as common reed, often grows in these dense monocultures. It's from Europe originally, Phragmites is. It has these extensive rhizomes, which are like its root system. So even though you see a lot of it above ground, there's actually more of it underneath the ground. And this is one of the reasons it's difficult to control, because, you know, we think of often like, what do I do with dandelions? I just dig them out, you know, and then it's gone. But you can't do that with species like this. The roots are really fine, so they just can't be managed that way.
That leads me to a question about well, the treatment, because over years, everybody has had wetlands in their mind when they see things in areas developing that kind of situation. So now don't contractors and builders and developers have to balance their wetland adjustments? So if you had for an example, a 1 acre pond that was taken over by this kind of activity, doesn't that put it into a non-workable situation for a developer?
It's definitely not good. Yeah. This can often impact, especially in their retention ponds like that. They tend to not drain very well after a while because of all this material in there. So yeah, it's definitely a problem. Sometimes people, if there's like an easement, often on those wetland areas that are set aside for construction, there's an easement on them through either the state of Michigan or sometimes through another organization. But control of invasive species is something you can do even in those easement areas, because obviously if the environment is looking like that, it's not really providing much benefit. So there's like one extra step that you have to go through if it's an area set aside like that. But yeah, they do want to encourage those areas to be healthy by treating and controlling Phragmites in them. Okay, so I already talked about a lot of the concerns with this one. Along the roads, the main one is just that it can grow so tall that, you know, you can imagine you get to a four-way stop and you just can't see around the corner. So that's one of the main reasons we work with the road commission on it, and they'll often mow it. Sometimes they have to mow it before or during the growing season, but they'll often mow it after treatment too, because that helps get the stands out of the way. So Phragmites, even when it's dead, it'll stay standing for years. The stalks are really strong, so it has to be knocked down or cut down with something. Otherwise, it just will continue being there. And there are some different control methods for this one, which I guess I'll get to in the next slide. So I'll just show you a couple more pictures. So when it first comes up, Phragmites looks like this. So just kind of these green stalks that you might see. This time of year, you're starting to see it. It's probably like, I would say 2 to 3 feet tall in most areas. And then this is some Phragmites this is probably like fall or winter. So it's kind of died off from the year. The stalks are brown. So the brown stalks, those individual stalks won't grow again. So if you do have that on your property, you can just clear those out. But the green stalks, those can spread really well. So you'll see Phragmites, even like a piece of it will go out across the water like a runner and like send off little shoots. So yeah, it's pretty annoying that way. So you have to be careful if you're cutting the live green stalks. Those can definitely resprout. And I'm not going to go in too much into the treatment today, but I'll just talk a little bit about it for Phragmites. And then, like I said, you know, we're happy to answer questions about treatment anytime. But, you know, with any species, there's going to be different treatment methods. With Phragmites, there's actually also a method where if you have a small amount, you can like spade it. So like cut the stalks with a shovel at a certain angle, or cut it below the water and keep it from growing up above the water, and that can drown it out. But we need to do something to kill the roots of the plant. So some methods of doing that with chemicals include just cutting the stalks and dabbing a little bit of the herbicide on the stalks. So you'd use a concentrated herbicide with this type of technique. But the advantage is, you know, you're not doing anything to any other plants, so it's very selective. And for bigger infestation, so there's a photo down here of just, you know, you can see a huge area of Phragmites. Typically, we're going to want to hire a contractor because, you know, they're used to working on these larger sites. Typically for the larger sites, they're going to be spraying an herbicide onto the leaves of the plant. And if it's in water, which Phragmites typically is in or very near water, it requires a permit to do the treatment. So that's another reason the contractor will know all of those requirements. It's really good if you can bundle these projects together. So if, you know, you have some and your neighbor has some and your next neighbor has some. You know, ideally you want to do all those at the same time, both because it's going to be more effective. Also, it's going to be cheaper because a lot of the costs of contractors doing work is just kind of getting to that area. So bundling projects together usually gets you a better price. And we do have a brochure, which is on our website about like, you know, what to think about when choosing a contractor. They're required to have a pesticide applicator license, things like that. So we've got some more resources available. Okay. So knotweed, I mentioned this one as well. This is a perennial shrub. And in this time of year, it looks like, I'm going to show you the pictures first. When it first comes up in the spring, it looks like this. It looks kind of like asparagus, but it has these red kind of bands along the stalks. Some people call it Michigan bamboo sometimes. We don't have a bamboo species in Michigan. And this time of year, it's not flowering yet. These white things are the flowers, but it looks kind of like this. It's already like, I would say at least 5 or 6 feet tall. So what happens is the long stalks come up and they kind of end up leaning over and making sort of an arc shape. And the leaves, if you look at them closely, are pretty distinctive. So they tend to there's a couple of different types, but like this, where they're flat on the back and then pointed on the tips. And in August is when the white flowers come out. So you can look for that as well. This one, as I mentioned, can be a problem with infrastructure, especially. It can go through, it kind of exploits the weakest areas. So if it can find a way to like get in next to a house or something, it might just go along the edge. Or even potentially into the house. So it is one you want to keep away from any infrastructure. It is strong enough to break even through house foundations. And this is another difficult one to control because of the rhizome. So again, what we see above ground is only a portion of it. And so if you just cut it down and mow it with this species, that's actually going to make it worse. Each of these little segments will sprout into a new plant. So that can quickly get overwhelming, and it grows really fast. So often people notice it because in spring it'll grow like several inches a day. So it grows really fast. And this is what it looks like in fall or winter. You'll see those dead stalks, the brown stalks just sticking up. And again, these stalks themselves aren't going to regrow. So if you do have those on your property, you can just clear them out and even compost them if you want, but be careful with all the green stalks because they will resprout. I think I didn't, oh yeah. So we've got, this is another example of one of our guides. So this is the homeowner's guide to small scale control. So what you can do yourself. And then we've also got a guide, which should be out pretty soon, which is more of like how to work with contractors. And it has a little table on like different herbicides that can be used with knotweed. Okay. So then I was going to talk a little bit about woody invasive species. These are probably some of the most common ones that you'll see just in yards or parks or anywhere else. So I'll just talk about a few of them today. You've likely seen these around. One of the most common is buckthorn. Its leaves, some of the leaves have these kind of jagged edge. This is common buckthorn, has these jagged edged leaves. It has these very kind of deep veins that you can look for. And the bark is really, it's like spotted. So it's mostly dark, but it'll have these white spots. And in the fall and winter, it gets like kind of deep purple berries, which you'll often see like falling off of it. And sometimes you even see like on trails and nearby. Birds do eat the berries, but as with many of these invasives, they're not very good. They don't have a good nutritional value. So basically they're kind of like sugary. So the birds like them, but they're not getting a lot of like good protein and stuff out of them. So they're not benefiting them that much. They tend to look like, buckthorn tends to look like a small tree or kind of a hedge. And then some other ones that you might see are autumn olive. This one just finished blooming recently. It got these very like kind of elaborate looking white flowers, and it was very strong smelling. The most distinctive thing about autumn olive is the back of the leaves are like white, kind of silvery looking. So if you see that, it's pretty distinctive. There's really not anything else that looks like that. This one, unfortunately, was a species that for a time people were encouraging people to plant because we thought it would be good for erosion control, but then it turns out it's extremely invasive. So this is now a restricted species in Michigan, which means it's legally regulated that you can't transport it, sell it, like transplant it on purpose. You know, with all these species that are prohibited or restricted, they're not going to cite you for just having it in your yard, but they don't want you to be selling it or transporting it or moving it. So if you're doing any of those things, that is something that that could be cited. And then some other common woody invasive species are the honeysuckles. So there's a ton of species of honeysuckles. There's a lot of invasive ones. There's a couple native ones, but a good way to tell is the bark is really like furrowed. I would say mostly brownish when you see it. And when you break the stalks, like they have to be like the second year stalks, so like a little bit bigger stalks. They're hollow inside. If you see that, then you're looking at an invasive honeysuckle. And these are another really common ones in like, you know, the edges of ball fields or something like that. One other way to tell the difference between the native and invasive is that this is an invasive one here. It has berries like along the whole branch. And the native ones, the berries are more clustered like in one place on the branch. So those are some ways to tell them apart. And then bittersweet, which we already talked about a little bit. This one is one to keep an eye out for, especially it starts out looking like this. It actually looks like this right now. You'll see it sometimes also along roadways or other areas, just kind of like these vines twisted together, kind of going up into the air. But where it's a real problem is when it grows around trees, because it can get really thick. I mean, it looks like a tree almost. Sometimes it gets really thick, and then it can literally strangle the trunk. Or the other thing it'll do is just, it'll have so many vines going up into the tree that the tree is so heavy that eventually it just like impacts the integrity of the tree, like all that extra weight. So definitely one to keep an eye out for as well. We have, I mean, there's a fair amount of all four of these species around. So I'm sure there's some in Farmington Hills area too. The good news with the woody invasive species, I think I didn't put a slide in here about that, but is that they're relatively easy to control. The easiest way, like the most kind of permanent way of controlling them, is to just cut them back and then treat the stumps with herbicide. You just have to do the stumps so they don't resprout. With them, it's not the roots so much, it's just that these woody things, like their biology is such that when they're cut back, what they do is like, it's called vigorous resprouting. So like instead of one big stump, you'll see like a whole bunch of little ones sprout off. So if you want to prevent that from happening, you need to either treat the stump. There's also some ways you can like cover the top with a really thick black garbage bag to deprive it of sunlight. So you need to do something. Another option, it's just more labor intensive, is just to cut it back like several times a year, like for a while, and eventually you'll kind of exhaust its ability to regrow. Okay. So I'm gonna shift into talking a little bit more about like these next invaders. So this is a table or a figure that we use a lot because it helps understand like where is our money best invested with invasive species. And once things get really common, like Phragmites and knotweed is, you know, getting close up here too, it's just really a long-term problem. So it costs a lot of money. There's a lot of area invested. So that's, you know, ideally we don't want to get to that point with all these new things. So what we want to do more so is either prevent them from being introduced. So we also talk a lot about like cleaning your boots when you go hiking, because you'll get mud on your boots and the mud will have seeds in them, and then you'll go hike somewhere else and maybe the mud falls off and the seeds get spread. Or the same thing with your boats or kayaks, you know, when you put them in the water, and then you take them out of the water again and go to a new place, you need to clean them off, or dry them for a long time, like a month, to be sure that, you know, you're not spreading anything between those places. The next thing we try to do is eradicate them. And that means if there's only a small number of populations, we're able to actually keep it from becoming common in an area. So that's just anytime it was found, we would go directly to that and try to eliminate it so that it wasn't able to spread. And so as time goes by with these invasive species, you know, we see the costs and the area infested increase. Okay, so a good example of this is European frogbit. This is a free-floating plant with quarter-sized leaves. So it's smaller than your typical native water lily, which those ones are more kind of like dinner plate sized often. These ones are like, you know, really pretty small. So it looks like a mini water lily. They'll be like more single plants, but then later in the year, more and more plants pop up, plus they send runners, kind of like strawberry plants. So they end up with this really thick, dense mat, which, as you can imagine, is not great for anything else living in that pond. This is a picture of frogbit on the surface of a pond, and there's just not a lot. One, it's depriving oxygen from getting, or depriving light from getting to other species in the pond. And then eventually there's going to be a big die off of all that material, which will crash the oxygen levels in the pond. So this is one that's still in the early stages. So we're trying to prevent it from spreading further. So here's some good close-up pictures of what it looks like. It should be blooming around now, pretty soon. And it has these kind of heart-shaped leaves this is basically the size variation that you might see. So from pretty little to bigger. The other way to tell the difference between water lilies and this is that frogbit is free floating, so it doesn't have a root, versus water lilies, if you've ever looked at them, you know, they have this big fleshy stalk that goes down from the lily, and it's actually attached to the bottom of the pond. So that's another good way to tell the difference. This is just a quick map showing where we've surveyed and looked for frogbit so far. And the turquoise dots are showing places where we found frogbit. So it's definitely in Novi, and there's not a dot on here, but also has been found in one pond in Mayberry State Park. So what we're trying to do right now is do expanded surveys. So this is where we found frogbit here and down here. And what we want to do is look in a much larger area to try to see, okay, is it sort of just luck that we found frogbit in a few areas, or is that really the only places where frogbit is? Because that helps us figure out, okay, yes, it's only in a few places, we can just go ahead and eradicate it. Or no, it's more widespread, but we can maybe prevent it from going into these larger lakes. That's the main thing. So far, it hasn't gotten into any boating lakes in Oakland County that we know of. So that's the main thing we're trying to prevent, because that would definitely increase its spread. So Farmington Hills is one area that is in the project area. And we're doing this work in collaboration with Friends of the Rouge is surveying the Rouge River watershed, which is this pink, all the pink here is the Rouge River watershed. So they're leading the surveys in the Farmington Hills and Farmington area. And then the Huron River Watershed Council is doing the surveys in the Huron River watershed, which is this green area. So we've been sending out like postcards and public notices, and we have a public meeting about it coming up, because we're trying to get access to, as you can imagine, what the land looks like in these areas. You know, it's not big parks, it's mostly privately owned land. So we're trying to get access if people have ponds or wetlands on their property, so that we can go take a look and just see if there's frogbit present there or not. Okay, so there's a lot of ways you can, even if you didn't remember any of the names of the species that I just talked about, there's a lot of ways that you can help. I already talked a little bit about preventing the spread. So clean, draining, drying boats and kayaks, cleaning your boots and gear after you go hiking, not releasing unwanted aquatic plants or fish. We often see in the fall, there's like a pulse of species that people have like in backyard water gardens, and they just release them into the rivers. So some of those species we don't think can overwinter in Michigan, but we really don't want to test that out. Just, you know, being responsible about doing that. And then moving firewood, I didn't talk too much about forest pests today, but moving firewood is the main way that all the forest pests are getting around. So you can think of emerald ash borer that killed all the trees. And there's some new ones like oak wilt that are impacting oak trees, and a couple other new things coming as well. So many of the pests will live underneath the bark. And so even when the tree is cut down and cut into firewood, if the bark's still on it and it hasn't been like steamed or in some way treated, all those pests are still alive. And we see this when many of the infestations of these species will start in like a campground area and then move out from there. So for identifying invasive species, you can look at all of our resources, of course. We encourage you, especially if they're the more unique species, like these early detection species, to report them. You can either email us directly or report them. There's an app called MISIN, M-I-S-I-N, or one called iNaturalist, which is really cool. In iNaturalist, just the advantage of that is that if you're not sure what it is, it uses photo recognition to give you some guesses of what it thinks it is, which can be really helpful. Or you can, as I said, just email us photos as well, and we can help with that. So you can control invasive species on your property. And you also want to think about the whole life cycle of this. So of course, as they say, nature abhors a vacuum. So you don't want to just cut down all your invasive species and not assume that something else is going to come in there. So as you're controlling the invasives and getting them back, you want to be either reseeding or replanting with some native bushes or other things, because otherwise you're just going to see something else popping up in that same area. We are in kind of the end right now. There's a couple still native plant sales. They're typically in spring and fall. And you can also volunteer. We do events where we help remove invasive species, or you can map them in your local areas. And I just wanted to highlight, we've got some other events and webinars coming up. So here's just a few of them. One, we're working with the Nature Conservancy on specifically talking about creating pollinator-friendly landscapes from preserves, large scale, to backyards. So there's a really cool movement right now to just, you know, convert some part of your lawn into native plants to support these other species. So can learn more about that. We have a public meeting, virtual public meeting coming up about European frogbit that I mentioned with these surveys coming up in July. And also in July, we've got a webinar specifically on managing Phragmites. And then we do some events as well. So we're working with Oakland County Parks on their Trailblazer walking series. And some of those highlight, they do them on all different kind of natural and ecological topics, but some of them are highlighting forest pests and diseases, ecological mowing, and different topics. And then one new thing this year for Oakland County too is mobile boat wash units. So these were actually purchased by the county commissioners, and they'll be available. One will be at Cass Lake, Dodge Park number 4 all summer, and the other one will be moving around each week to different locations in Oakland County. And this is to encourage people to remember to do clean, drain, dry, and also actually provide some tools that they can use to clean off their boat or vacuum up water, that type of thing. And so we're going out a couple of days to where the boat washes are, just to kind of talk more about them, give out free giveaways, that type of thing. And then we'll have some other work days coming up that we don't have dates for just yet. That's like where we would demonstrate, like, this is how you could treat this species, and this is what it looks like, that type of thing. So with that, I would just like to thank all of our funders, and then here is our website, and I can always email all these too, but oaklandinvasivespecies.org is our website. We're also on Facebook and YouTube. So all of our webinars we post on YouTube, and we've also started doing some shorter videos. So for example, there's like a 3-minute video about woody invasive species that shows them at different times of the year. So feel free to contact me anytime if you've got questions about invasives. And I think that's my last slide here. Yeah. So let me exit out of this.
Erica, you mentioned in
Yeah.
just a brief comment about oh, good time for a memory lapse. Um, anyway, anybody else have a question? It might come back to me.
See if yours returns. I'm not sure if you actually mentioned it, but what is the Six Rivers Land Conservancy?
Sure. So CISMAs don't exist as like a legal entity. So we always work with what's called a fiduciary to manage our grants and everything. So our Oakland County CISMA right now, our fiduciary is Six Rivers Land Conservancy. So they're one of the 3 land conservancies in this that operate at least in some, actually probably 4 that operate in some capacity in Oakland County. But what land conservancies do is they work with people and also governments on either donated land. Like sometimes people will want to like donate their property to preserve it over time. Maybe it'll become a park or something. They also work with governments on like creating new parks. So there's something called the Michigan Natural Resources Trust Fund. And that's money set aside from oil revenues in the state, and it goes back into preserving natural land. So a lot of times what happens is there'll be a property that's for sale that they want to buy and turn into a park. And so Six Rivers or another land conservancy will work with those organizations on like getting that land. Usually they will purchase it initially and then they'll wait for them to get the funding, and then it will be turned into a park. And they also do small scale things like, say you had a 5-acre property or something and you wanted to preserve part of it in perpetuity in its natural state. You could decide to like designate a couple acres that way. So it doesn't necessarily have to be public land. But the idea is really just like having more land set aside for natural uses is really their goal. So they work to set aside land and then to manage the land. If they own it, they'll manage it just like many of the parks around here.
And what are the Six Rivers?
The 6 rivers, oh boy. All right, it's the Clinton, the Huron, the Rouge, the Flint, the Shiawassee. Okay, I'm missing one. I think it might be the Black River. So 6 Rivers area is larger than just Oakland County. So they work in like Oakland, Macomb, St. Clair, Genesee, and Shiawassee, I believe. So theirs is a little bit larger than just the rivers in Oakland County.
Oh,
Memory came back. And speaking of rivers, it's a good connection.
there you go.
Zebra mussels.
Mm-hmm.
My nephew did some research work on the zebra mussel when it was the topic of the day.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't heard a word in the last 10 years about zebra mussels.
We
But since
still
we're talking about the watershed and the rivers, one of the concerns back at the time that he was doing his research was to find out if there was an invasive action into the watershed rivers from the zebra mussels that obviously came in from international shipping situations. Do you have any kind of connection with that stuff these days?
We definitely still have a lot of zebra mussels in Michigan. Actually, what's happened is, at least in the Great Lakes themselves, quagga mussels, which are related to zebra mussels, but another species, have become more dominant than the zebra mussels because the zebra mussels need to attach to something like a physical structure, and the quagga mussels can just like be on the bottom of the lake. So what's happened is, if you would look at the bottom of the lake now, you would see all these mussels across the bottom of it. As far as I know, they're not typically seen as much in rivers as lakes, but you'll find them in a lot of inland lakes as well. It's definitely not just the Great Lakes. I think for the you know, zebra mussels are managed where they're enough of a problem, like if there's infrastructure or something that they have to take them off of it. But typically, other than trying to decontaminate boats when they leave one body of water to go to another, because there's still lots of bodies of water out west that don't have zebra mussels. But for the Great Lakes area and for Michigan, we're kind of too late to do too much about preventing them from being in those areas. And the other thing that they've caused is a lot of like the lake, well, I mean, it may appear better, but there'll be very little, they eat all the tiny microorganisms, right? So they'll filter those all out of the water and the water will be really clear, which seems sort of good, but isn't that good because typically there were other things that would eat all those tiny microorganisms. So it's definitely still causing a lot of those kind of like chain reaction issues where what used to eat them, like our native mussels, are really not doing very well.
So what's the migratory methodology for these mussels to get into inland lakes?
Usually on boats. So because they attach, so when they're the veligers, when they come out, the little zebra mussels, they actually are free floating in the water. But then once they settle down, they attach to some physical surface. So it could be a dock or some other thing, but it could also be a boat that happens to be in there. And then when the boat goes to another lake, it's going to spread those along with it. So that's the main pathway.
Therefore, boat washing is really important from that particular point of view.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's not just the zebra mussels. It's, you know, there's actually lots of like even fish diseases that we can't see at all. But that if we clean our boats off, then we definitely won't spread them. And there's lots of plants too, and other smaller species that, again, we might not be able to see necessarily, but it doesn't mean that they're not there and being moved along as well. Yeah.
Anybody else?
Yeah.
Penny,
Yep, go Penny.
I'm sorry I came late to the party,
No problem.
but did you cover the grasses that seem to have taken over on the sides of the roads and in areas that are wet and wetlands? Those tall grasses, they look
Yeah.
pretty, but are they bad?
Yeah, those are Phragmites. Let me go back here and
Well, you don't have to repeat it. I was just wondering.
yes, they are invasive. They're called Phragmites or common reed. And yeah, they are invasive. So we work to treat the ones on the county road right-of-ways anyway. So they're actually looking pretty good. We just completed a bunch of surveys on that. So they're looking better than they were anyway. But yes, that's Phragmites, and it's a real problem. Wetlands is probably, from an ecological perspective, that's probably the worst area that they're invading because they won't grow in really deep water. They won't grow in like several feet of water, but they do like the shorelines or especially wetlands that can typically fill in that whole area.
Where did it come from?
That one's from Europe. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm,
I
yeah.
didn't do it. Okay. Assuming no other questions. Anyway, many thanks, Erica. That was fabulous.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
great
our recording will be processed and probably put up within the next couple of hours. It'll be on our website, so you can point people there if they need to see this particular presentation.
Okay.
So Lynn, you want to take us away now?
sure. The other thing that we do officially for Rotary is refresh our memory at the end of every meeting on the Rotary four-way test. And so if you can read what's behind me,
Yep, you're doing a good job.
we can recite it, think about it, however you wish to follow. But is it the truth? Is it fair to
We're all concerned.
build goodwill and better
Friendships
and will it
will
be
be
beneficial
beneficial to all concerned.
And with that, the ringing of the bell, the meeting is officially ended. Bill can handle it however he wants from here.
Anyway, again, many thanks, Erica. That was great.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Erica.
Everyone
Okay.
have a good day.
Thanks, Erica.
Yeah.
Bye, folks.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thanks, Stan.